Before we begin, take a moment. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Tonight, we're talking about all the times medieval humanity came this close to deleting itself. Not from meteors or monsters, but from deeply confident, universally accepted, bad decisions. If medieval medicine had a customer satisfaction survey, the results would be impossible to interpret, mostly because the customers were no longer alive. The core philosophy was beautifully simple. If something is wrong inside the body, remove fluids until either balance is restored or the patient stops complaining permanently. This was bloodletting, the medieval equivalent of fixing your computer by throwing it out a window. Effective in one very specific sense. Doctors believed the body was ruled by 4 humors. Sickness meant one was misbehaving. Which one? Less important. The cure, regardless of symptoms, was almost always bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Infection? Bloodletting. Feeling a bit sad? Bloodletting, just to stay ahead of things. The reasoning was elegant. Sick people are weak. Therefore, they clearly have too much blood. Remove it, preferably quickly. Veins were opened with knives. Leeches were applied. Patients were often bled until they fainted, which doctors interpreted as the treatment working. Unconsciousness was a promising sign. Refusing wasn't cautious, it was non-compliant. During epidemics, this practice turned catastrophic. People already weakened by hunger and disease were relieved of the very substance keeping their organs functioning. If the patient worsened, the logic doubled down. Not enough blood had been removed. The solution to a failing treatment was more treatment. From a modern perspective, a slow-motion disaster. From a medieval perspective, careful, responsible medicine. Humanity didn't just fight disease, it politely escorted it inside, handed it a knife, and said, "Please, take your time." Once medicine had finished bleeding people into the afterlife, medieval dietary advice stepped in. During famines and outbreaks, authorities warned against fruits and vegetables, not because they were spoiled, but because they were too moist. Moist foods, theory stated, corrupted the humors. Apples were suspicious. Greens were dangerous. Instead, people were told to eat heavy, dry foods, meat, stale bread, thick porridge. Excellent advice if you were a well-fed noble. For a starving peasant, it was a starvation strategy with religious backing. When people did eat, digestion was a nightmare. Heavy foods required energy that sick bodies did not have. Some doctors advised avoiding food almost entirely during illness, believing digestion distracted the body from healing. So, during outbreaks, people responded by eating less, sometimes nothing. Entire generations were thinned not by the famine itself, but by the instructions on how to behave during it. Medieval people had many skills, farming without machinery, building cathedrals without calculators. What they did not have was a working concept of water hygiene. Waste management followed an optimistic principle, not our problem once it leaves the house. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, all were tossed into the street, dumped into pits, or encouraged toward the nearest river. Rivers were assumed to possess magical cleansing powers. Latrines were built directly over waterways. Entire neighborhoods flushed themselves into the same rivers they later used for drinking, washing, and brewing. If you ever wondered why medieval ale was so popular, it's because the fermented liquid was statistically safer than water that had recently hosted a parade of human regrets. One sick person upstream meant everyone downstream was a communal biology experiment. When outbreaks happened, no one suspected the water. Why would they? Water looked clean. Blame went elsewhere. Bad air, sinful behavior, foreign influence. People burned incense, rang church bells, or fled the city, often carrying the disease with them. The water remained untouched, unquestioned, and enthusiastically contaminated. When disease struck, people desperately searched for a cause. Unfortunately, instead of discovering bacteria, they discovered vibes.
and the vibes were bad. Clearly, something was to blame. Medieval society decided that something was cats. Cats had a public relations problem. They were quiet, independent, active at night. This made them suspicious. They were associated with witches, demons, and general moral failure. So communities began killing them. A lot of them. The logic was flawless. If cats are evil, and evil causes disease, fewer cats means less disease. Unfortunately, cats were also the main predators of rats, and rats, as it turns out, were deeply involved in the entire plague situation. With cats gone, rat populations exploded. Fleas thrived. The plague spread faster than ever. At no point did society pause and say, "Interesting. Ever since we removed the animals that kill rats, there seemed to be more rats." That would have required admitting a mistake. Instead, the worsening plague was proof that not enough cats had been eliminated, so more were killed. Sometimes dogs too, just in case. The rats watched from the shadows, deeply appreciative. When people realized disease wasn't responding to bloodletting, starvation, or cat elimination, they escalated to a bold new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. This was the flagellant movement. Flagellants believed plague was divine punishment. The solution was to impress God with suffering. Groups of men marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains. The logic was simple. If God sees enough blood, he will stop the plague. These processions were loud, dramatic, and highly contagious, spiritually and biologically. They drew crowds. Everyone stood close together, breathing deeply, sharing air, sweat, and everything else. Wherever the flagellants went, plague followed. Instead of isolating disease, medieval society turned it into a touring performance. Medieval cities were marvels of human achievement and also ideal living conditions for disease. Houses were packed together so tightly neighbors could borrow salt through the window. Streets were narrow and dark. Ventilation was a rumor. People lived on top of each other. Animals lived indoors. Waste was tossed into the street. When disease entered this environment, it didn't spread, it exploded. One cough reached 10 people. Isolation was nearly impossible, yet cities believed density was safety. Walls kept enemies out. Crowds meant protection. The idea that humans themselves could be the threat was uncomfortable. Once society accepted that disease wasn't staying inside city walls, it needed a scapegoat. Fear demanded a target. Witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, healers, midwives, anyone slightly unusual. Entire communities became convinced that burning the wrong people would somehow disinfect reality. This had drawbacks. It removed people who were often useful, like healers. Executions created large, tightly packed crowds. Persecution caused panic, making people flee and carry disease with them. It was a dangerous feedback loop. When disease worsened, it proved guilt had not been punished enough, so more people were accused. Humanity didn't just understand disease, it declared war on imaginary enemies. When medieval medicine wasn't busy removing blood or banning vegetables, it turned to its next great idea: poison. Not accidental poison, intentional, doctor-approved poison, because if disease was strong, the cure clearly needed to be stronger, ideally lethal but in a controlled way. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, and sulfur. These substances were believed to purge illness by forcing it out violently. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea, all excellent signs. If you felt worse, the medicine was working. Mercury was especially popular. It was shiny, mysterious, and deeply toxic. 3 qualities medieval people found very convincing. Patients who survived the illness often didn't survive the cure. Trust made this especially dangerous. These poisons were prescribed by authority figures: doctors, monks, scholars, people who were trained, respected, and absolutely confident. During major outbreaks, death simply outpaced organization. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Corpses were stacked in homes, streets, and public spaces. Mass graves were dug hastily, often near towns, rivers, or wells. Decay contaminated water sources. Insects flourished. Disease didn't just spread, it soaked into daily life. Ironically, fear of the dead made things worse. People believed corpses carried spiritual danger, so they avoided touching them, delaying burials even further. At some point, medieval people noticed a troubling pattern. When someone got sick, everyone around them soon followed. The observation was correct. The conclusion they drew was complicated. Isolation felt cruel, unchristian, borderline suspicious. If someone was ill, the moral response was not distance, it was closeness. Family gathered around the sickbed, friends visited, neighbors stopped by to offer prayers, advice, and germs. Leaving someone alone felt like abandonment, so they crowded in. Entire households slept in the same room, often the same bed. This wasn't negligence,